A bitterly cold morning at the end of January 1945. Major Charity Adams felt the chilly air sweep through the rickety C-54 military cargo plane she had boarded less than an hour before. They had taken off from Washington, D.C. Adams did not know where they were going.
She was told, you have an assignment to go overseas, report to this air terminal. So here she is, this young woman, about 25, 26 years old. She wasn't sure where she was going or what she had to do.
In her hands, she held the answer.
She received a brown envelope and says, do not open it until you get on the plane. That's the typical military way, you have no idea sometimes what your next assignment is.
Until the 1940s, no women had officially been allowed to serve within the ranks of the US Army, except as nurses. Charity Adams, a young African-American woman, had applied to join the first class of women officer candidates as soon as she could. She was the first black woman to be commissioned in the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps and quickly rose through the ranks. Major Adams was travelling across the Atlantic Ocean by plane. The rest of her unit would sail.
"855 women identified as African American or Negro or colored were tested to make sure that they could perform overseas. So they had to undergo psychological testing. Men didn't have to have a high school diploma, but women did. So that's a little discrimination right there. Women had to be smarter.
Few of these soldiers had ever been away from home, let alone overseas. None knew where they were going. At last, Major Adams opened the envelope.
It's almost like, a television show, Mission Impossible or something. This is an assignment. Do not open this for 60 minutes. And when that 60 minutes is up, you look around, everybody opens the envelope, and then she sees this assignment.
I'm Helena Bonham Carter, and for BBC Radio 4, this is History's Secret Heroes. True stories of deception, acts of resistance, and courage from World War II. Charity Adams and the 6888.
I am Colonel Edna W. Cummings, retired Army. I was born in a military family at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. My father served with the famous 82nd Airborne, so it's something that I grew up with. It's a lifestyle that I've always embraced.
A few years ago, Edna Cummings came across a story about another black woman officer who had served in the Army, Lieutenant Colonel Charity Edna Adams. Edna Cummings was immediately struck by that unusual middle name, the same as her first name.
It was an instant connection, first of all because of the name, and then secondly because of some of the challenges she had.
Despite a career of military service, Colonel Cummings had never heard of Colonel Adams or her unit, the 6,888th Central Postal Directory Battalion, nicknamed the 6888. Women had always served in the United States Army. For example, a number had fought in the Revolutionary War and the Civil War, passing as men. Yet during the First World War, and at the beginning of the Second, the only option formally open to women who wished to serve was nursing. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor at the end of 1941, the United States was drawn into the Second World War.
And the purpose of women joining the military was to release men for combat. When the war started, there was a need for manpower and people overseas. So women and the nation mobilized to support the war.
In 1942, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was established and was soon renamed simply the Women's Army Corps. Joining the WACs, as they were called, allowed women the privileges and benefits of their male counterparts. From the start, though, the opportunities for women of colour were limited. The Women's Army Corps had a quota of 10% African American recruits. These women were known as 10%ers. Charity Adams was one of only 39 black women selected for officer training.
She was in the first class of women officers. First women's officer class in Fort Des Moines, Iowa.
This is Stanley Early, son of Major Adams.
I can remember her talking about the shock at the time of Pearl Harbor, and I can also remember her talking about how I got to do something about this. This was an opportunity for something really different and meaningful, and so she wanted to be a part of it.
Charity Adams was born in South Carolina in 1918. The state had been part of the Confederacy, defending slavery in the American Civil War. That war had ended slavery, yet racism remained rife. Adams grew up at a time when strict racial segregation was enforced under what were called the Jim Crow laws. These laws were designed to exclude African Americans from equal participation in public life. For example, African Americans in South Carolina could not be served lunch in the same room or at the same counter as white patrons. They had to use separate entrances in factories, separate drinking fountains, separate toilets. African Americans were banned from white parks and swimming pools, and from South Carolina's best beaches. A complicated patchwork of legislation and social pressures limited their rights to education, medical care, and voting.
I remember my mother talking about the first time she registered to vote. The issue was, depending on what your political party was your grandparent in that party? If not, then you couldn't vote.
Adams graduated from Booker T. Washington High School as valedictorian, meaning she was the highest performing student in her class. She graduated and became a teacher. Later, she went on to Ohio State University to study for a master's degree in vocational psychology. Then, the United States joined the Second World War and everything changed. Adams became one of the first African American women officers to be commissioned within the Women's Army Corps.
There was only certain tasks they could perform, secretarial tasks, administrative, nothing that involved being on the front lines or in combat. We had African American women who had been trained perhaps as medics, as an example, but they were forced to scrub floors in a hospital.
If a black soldier refused these degrading duties, she could face the full weight of military punishment.
There's actually a case that happened at Fort Devens, Massachusetts, where 4 African American women were court-martialed because they refused to perform menial tasks. There's another case where 3 women were beaten in Elizabethtown, Kentucky, for sitting in a whites-only section of a bus station while they were in uniform.
Adams was stationed at Fort Des Moines, Iowa. There, she was given more and more responsibilities, first as a company commander, then as a training supervisor and training center control officer.
Charity's white male peers quite frankly accepted her because many of them had come from different parts of the United States and understood that this was a smart, sharp, talented officer, and they wanted her to receive that type of respect. So she decided to go to the officers' club with one of her white male co-workers, a fellow officer. But the next day, she received a verbal reprimand for race mixing.
From these early days of her military career, Adams established a reputation for being quietly steely.
The women formed a band, the white women formed a band, but would not allow African American women. And Charity Adams was frustrated about that and took it upon herself to ensure that black women had the opportunity to play music, and she formed their own band, and this band became well known throughout the United States. It traveled on tours.
From 1943, several white women's army units were dispatched to serve in the European theatre of operations. Yet the black women's units were still assigned to menial tasks at home. African American newspapers and campaigners had fought hard for black women to be allowed to serve. The veteran campaigner Mary McLeod Bethune, dubbed the First Lady of Negro America, managed to secure the support of the real First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt. Finally, in November 1944, the War Department agreed that black women in the Women's Army Corps could also be sent to Europe and created the 6888.
The Army indicated that there's a massive male problem within the European theater of operations.
A male problem? That was putting it mildly. The Postal Service had almost entirely ground to a halt.
Europe was the worst of the backlog. Mail had not been delivered to troops for about 2 years.
The United States Army decided that the person to lead this force was Major Charity Adams. Like everyone else in the armed forces, Major Adams had heard talk of the enormous scale of the military postal backlog. There were 7 million people in the United States services in the European theatre of operations. They moved around a lot, and it was hard to keep track of them. For instance, there were 7,500 people called Robert Smith. At the beginning of 1945, the Allies had just emerged victorious from the Battle of the Bulge, the last major German offensive on the Western Front. Winning this battle had taken every resource they could muster. Personal communications fell by the wayside. An extraordinary stockpile of undelivered mail had built up in Birmingham, including 6 aeroplane hangars of Christmas parcels. For soldiers in the 1940s and their families, the post was the only means of communication. Millions of soldiers had not heard from their loved ones. The news that was contained in those letters was beyond value. Love letters from their sweethearts, their children growing up, the health of their parents. Precious words that could mean everything to the soldiers they were meant for.
17 to 20 million pieces of mail estimated in England alone. The Army says we need to fix this problem.
And the soldiers sent to fix that problem were Major Adams and the 6888. It was their task to sort through the mountains of letters and parcels and organise their delivery to American troops all across Europe. Major Adams was expected to get it done in 6 months.
King Edward School in Birmingham, England is where the 6888 was stationed, and they lived there and worked in facilities close by, where the mail would come in.
On their first morning in Birmingham, Major Adams and her troops walked into the warehouse that would be their new place of work. A vast space, and dark because the windows had been blacked out against bombing raids. Once inside, they realised that the problem was even worse than they had anticipated.
Some of that mail had been sitting there for a year. Imagine piles and piles of cookies and cakes sitting in a warehouse, and what would happen in a year, and who would be nibbling on that for a year. And you've got to go through all of that.
The troops took in the scene, more letters than they could ever have imagined. Rats scuttling over mouldy parcels. How on earth would they resolve this?
And the task of finding those people, where were the units? Where were these people? Were these people still alive? It was a gigantic task.
Major Adams commanded a force of over 800 women, few, if any, of whom had been to Britain before. Inevitably, the troops of the 6888 faced extra scrutiny.
A lot of people wanted to see them fail. They represented not only themselves, but they represented their race. So there was a lot of pressure to deliver.
Major Adams did what she had been trained to do. She took charge.
I think she looked at it as a systems engineering problem. She used her vocational psychology to bring out the best of the 855 women, just observing them and seeing who could do what. So the women who had to sort mail, she set up 3 shifts. So you think of a systems engineer. You want to maximize throughput. You want to be able to touch a button, and you want the system to start and to become very efficient.
Compared to frontline combat, sorting the post may sound rather humdrum. The women of the 688 had not been given a glamorous job, but what they were doing was essential for the morale of those who were fighting.
If you're in a wartime environment, the shelter may be a tent, it may be a hole in the ground. So you're there, you're alone, you're cold, you're hungry. You haven't heard from someone you care about. You know you can do your job, but in the back of your mind, I haven't seen my child in 2 years. I haven't seen my parents. They don't know if I'm dead or alive. I don't know what's going on with them. That's why morale is so important. No mail, low morale was the motto of the 688. If the troops don't get mail, they have low morale.
It wasn't only the morale of far-flung soldiers that Major Adams had to worry about. The women of her own battalion faced discrimination, and she had to stand up for them.
The Red Cross had a hotel. They had more than one hotel, but in London they had a hotel for American soldiers who were on leave. That system of hotels around the UK was in place, but then when the 688 arrived, they set up a hotel for black women that was separate from the hotel for other military women in the UK. And my mother made it clear that they were not going. We're not going to a segregated facility. We are here, we're serving, we're going through what everybody else is going through, and, we need the same treatment, no more, no less.
Major Adams ensured that the women who served under her were treated with the same respect and decency that was afforded to white male soldiers.
She knew that, especially for African-American women, hair was important. That's our crown. It was true then, it's true now. She set up beauty parlors. She also set up a recreational facility for the women, and she allowed the women to participate in sports teams. And they were very successful, won tournaments throughout Europe, basketball, softball. She also encouraged the women to have entertainment groups. Other units, male and female, would come to watch these black women perform because there were black aid workers, black nurses.
Word soon spread about how committed and efficient the troops were under Major Adams' command. In March 1945, an American general visited.
So he says, I want to inspect your troops. She said, sir, I understand that. However, I have a shift system going and I cannot interrupt the shift pattern for inspection. I have one group is sleeping, one group is working, so I have about maybe 200 people for you to inspect.
Major Adams had already refused to let the general enter the quarters where the women were sleeping.
And he says, I want to see everyone. And she says, no, sir, you cannot.
The general was not used to being told no. He looked stunned.
After a moment, he says, okay, I'll send a white lieutenant here to show you how it's done. And she says, over my dead body. Now, first of all, in the military, you don't talk to generals that way. But she was so frustrated, her response was just automatic.
For this insubordination, the general threatened to summon Major Adams to a court-martial. With the reputation of the 688 hanging in the balance, Major Adams began to file counter-charges against him.
She decided, okay, when he said the word white, he violated an article of war or the rule that said we are in this environment and we are not to talk about race. So she says, I'll court-martial him. If he's going to court-martial me, I'll draw up charges against him.
The general soon dropped the idea of court-martialing Major Adams and later admitted she had earned his respect. For many of the black women who came from segregated states, living in England was liberating. They faced less formal discrimination than they were used to at home.
And the women had freedoms. They had freedoms to shop and go to theaters, unlike the freedoms within the United States that were segregated. They dined with these the civilians in England on the weekends, had tea with them. So it was a pleasant experience, and I believe it was empowering, because once you've been in an oppressed environment and you experience freedom, it's hard to go back to that oppression the same way.
The people of Birmingham, too, learned that real African American women were not the offensive stereotypes of servants and floozies that they had been shown at the cinema. A local newspaper, the Sunday Mercury, wrote, "These whacks are very different from the coloured women portrayed on the films. The whacks have dignity and proper reserve." The women of the 6888 never lost sight of their mission to clear that postal backlog. Somehow, the 6888 had to sort letters addressed to troops with the same name and ensure they reached their intended recipients. For example, the 7,500 Robert Smiths.
Each Robert Smith had a locator card, and it took a lot of detective work. For example, a locator card has a serial number. Each soldier had to fill one out. And it's hard to do that when you're constantly moving every 60 to 90 days. That was the key to identifying which Robert Smith or which Buster.
The soldiers became expert detectives. They learned to spot tiny details, similarities with previous packing materials, distinctive smells, colour rubbed off from one item to another, damage from moisture. Anything could serve as a clue.
One lady, who's deceased now, mentioned that she opened a package with a watch in it, and she looked to see which person it went to, and then said, all right, there's, I'll use an example, a Jim Smith.
The 6888 skillfully reassembled packages that had fallen apart or had been half-eaten by rats, carefully piecing whatever remained back together. Soon, these long-delayed letters and packages began to reach soldiers who had waited for them.
When the 6888 arrived in Birmingham, England, the Army said, all right, it'll probably take you about 6 months to clear the backlog of mail. The 6888 was able to clear that backlog in 3 months, and that broke all mail records.
The mission was so successful that the women of the 6888 were swiftly redeployed to Rouen in France, where there was an even greater postal backlog to tackle. Some of the letters and parcels there had not been moved for 3 years. In December 1945, after the war ended, Major Adams was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, making her the highest-ranking African-American woman in the U.S. Army at the time. She could have continued to serve in the Pentagon, but chose instead to go back and complete her degree in vocational psychology.
It's important to remember that the 6888 was something that happened that was wonderful, that was important, but she was in her 20s, and she died at 82. And she did so many things.
Colonel Adams early became a college dean. She was committed to the civil rights movement with a special focus on desegregating schools. In an interview with the Women's Army Corps Oral History Program in 1990, Colonel Adams Early was asked about making military history.
Well, you don't really think history when you're doing something.
No,
it's not history until after you do it. Mm-hmm. So actually, I understood that several officers had wanted that assignment, but I had the most troop experience. So if you're going to send nearly 1,000 people overseas, you want somebody who has troop experience. So it was almost a case of not having much choice. Although I didn't know what the job was, and I didn't know where I was going when I left the stage, I knew that, and this is the premise that I have used in the Army and any place else, given the same opportunity and training, I'm sure I can do as well as anybody else.
There was one thing that she was particularly proud of, and that was in the mid-1990s when there was an event in Washington that was honoring black veterans of all wars, but particularly World War II.
Colonel Adams Early was invited to introduce President Bill Clinton.
When Clinton came on stage, he started out by saying, I don't want to put a damper on the festivities of this evening.
But I'm just sitting here thinking whether, as Commander-in-Chief, I should dismiss or simply demote whoever it was who arranged for me to speak after Colonel Early.
Lieutenant Colonel Charity Adams Early died in 2002. Years later, when Colonel Cummings came across the story of Colonel Adams and the 6888, she was determined to ensure that their work in the Second World War would be commemorated. In 2018, a monument to the women of the 6888 was unveiled in Kansas. A bronze bust of Colonel Adams sits above her words. There is no pleasure in achievement if it is not shared. The names of hundreds of women who served in the 6888 are on a black granite panel below.
They underwent the hardship so I could serve, to create an opportunity.
Colonel Cummings worked to award the 6888 the highest expression of appreciation that the United States Congress can bestow, the Congressional Gold Medal. This was signed into law by President Joe Biden in March 2022.
And it's really been kind of wonderful. It's like choking me up type wonderful to see this kind of response. And the other thing is, people forgot that women, particularly black women, were involved in the war at all.
It's changed the historical narrative of African American women who served in the United States and abroad in World War II. And black women now know that they were part of shaping U.S. military history.
Next time on History's Secret Heroes, an army unit with one job: to put on a show for an audience who wants to kill them.
We pretended that we were the real troops, so that the real troops could do their thing miles up the Rhine, because the Germans would think we were them.
The Ghost Army.